Good evening, Tom. How are you?
I'm well, Simon, thank you. I hope you are too.
I am. I'm just home. I was through in Edinburgh today, or as we call it here in the West, Mordor. It was very cold through there, colder than it is in Glasgow tonight, but I think we're all going to be hit with frost tonight. But that's where I've been all day, in the fair city.
And what brought you to the capital, Simon?
I just like to go through sometimes to remind myself how lucky I am to live here in the West.
Well, if that does it for you, Simon, then I'm pleased for you.
We're meeting friends because we're going on holiday in January, so it was the last chance to see them. It was a really sunny afternoon. It was beautiful today. How have you got on this week with your homework, with your listening to our podcasts?
Very interesting cases this week, Simon, and a couple of difficult ice cream wars. Peter Sutcliffe, the so-called Yorkshire Ripper. These are difficult cases, and we like to celebrate the police service. I think that's right. We both enjoyed our police service and took a lot from it, and in some cases it's kind of defined us, really. But the truth is that there have been some disasters too, and these two cases are good examples of that. So there's a lot to talk about tonight.
That's for sure. And the first one that you mentioned, the ice cream wars, these are on Monday through to Saturday, 6 podcasts, one every day on Crime Time Inc. And it's our research team who take a deep dive into these cases and produce that short summary, really 10 or 15-minute summary of the cases, historic cases. And until we hear them during the week, we don't have much preparation for it either. Some of them are new to me and even you, incredibly, and some of them we've been personally involved in. It gives us a good chance to cover the cases because in most cases, Tom, these inquiries have been dealt with exhaustively over the years in the press when you think about Whitechapel murders and Birkenhead. But what we like to do is to look at the social context of them, how they were dealt with at the time and how that's informed policing moving forward thereafter.
That's right, Simon. On the subject of the ice cream wars, that would be your era. Were you involved in that one?
No, I wasn't. I came into the serious crime squad when the trial was on the go. I was only very much listening to the gossip in the squad. I wasn't involved in the inquiry at all.
It was horrific. I remember it very well, but because it was such a horrific crime. There were 5 dead and another person died later.
That's right. A baby died thereafter. Yeah.
It was a hellish thing. And it was, 1984 was just at the very peak of the first wave of heroin, where we were having huge difficulties right across Scotland, but particularly Edinburgh and Glasgow. I remember it very well because of the horrendous body count. At the time, we were really at the peak of the first wave of heroin. Organised crime was starting to get seriously involved in gangs. Our ice cream vans, too, were often conduits to drug dealing. It was one of the methods used. We had a couple of bad fire-raising cases as well. None of them with that number of fatalities, but there were 1 or 2 where we had double fatalities. It just... putting something lit through the letterbox of a tenement flat with horrendous consequences during the night.
Very often with fire-raising, Tom, which we both dealt with, seems to be more regular back then than it is now. I don't know, though. I don't have any knowledge of that. But what was always a feature of it was that there was a randomness to it. You just said it there. You put a piece of lighted paper in anywhere, and you don't have control of that situation thereafter. So it could end up in fatalities. It could end up in a horrific destruction of property as well. You never really know. It's such a reckless act, fire raising, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. The other factor that we had in there was a fashion at that time in many of the houses then, they put polystyrene tiles on the kitchen ceilings, a sort of decorative polystyrene tiles. And when there was a fire, they gave off poisonous smoke. And quite often, the fire fatalities that we had and that I had were not people who had been burned to death, but people who had asphyxiated with this horrible polystyrene smoke from these tiles. It were terrible things. I hope they have all been removed now, but it was one of these fashion things of the 70s and 80s, which was just deadly dangerous.
It wasn't just hotels, Tom. It was settees like that as well back in the 60s, and different pieces of apparatus, furniture about the house. We didn't have the same regulations regarding fire that we do now.
And there were no fire alarms. And sometimes because of housebreaking, people would bolt shut their windows to prevent access. And of course, that prevented them escaping too. So there were quite a number of disasters. But the ice cream was that particular murder. And then, of course, the subsequent investigation and how it all came apart. To be honest with you, Simon, notwithstanding the holes in the investigation, I'm pretty sure they got the right people. I mean, Campbell, T.C. Campbell, was a horrendous individual from what I can gather.
Yeah.
Involved in all sorts of violent crime. But it came unpicked, and it was all about statements, and it was about evidence and identification, and
a witness changing his mind, Tom, as well.
Yeah,
William Love.
A witness changing his mind, and you wonder, which of his accounts were truthful,
That's
if
right.
any.
How can you rely on anything that comes out of his mouth? That's all.
Well, that's the trouble. When you're fishing in a pond full of criminals, who can you trust, and what is the standard of witnesses? And that's why, of course, it's one of the reasons why we've come to depend so much on forensic science.
Yeah.
There's a truth in that. It's an interpretation, yes, but you're not dependent on witnesses, and particularly dodgy witnesses.
Tom, you're saying there that no doubt Campbell was a real rascal of his day, as was Steele. They were both career criminals. Do you think there's an element, I think maybe what my mother would say, if you fly with a cross, you get shot with a cross. Do you think there's an element of that about this as well, that there's no question, if it wasn't them, they were involved. There's no doubt about that, as far as the police were concerned at the time. And we maybe never got everyone that was involved. There was maybe more to it than that. What do you think of the old adage about flying with a cross?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. My old mother was one of her favourites as well. You're dead right, but of course in the cold light of day, when the evidence is held up and is found to be flawed, even many years later, it brings disrepute on the police service. What I do remember about that time is the tremendous pressure there was on to get a result for that case, because it was the largest case of mass murder for many years, and it was symptomatic of gangs getting out of control with all the residences, particularly in your city. So there was a huge pressure on the investigating officers, massive pressure.
I can't help thinking about Sheila Anderson, because that was a wake-up call in your neck of the woods about the crime and organised crime involved in prostitution down in the Leith area. I think this was a wake-up call to Strathclyde Police about drugs and about just how serious that marketplace had become, because there was so much money involved in it at the time. Dare I suggest that it's evolved now, that just got a degree of business acumen and some rules and regulations that the criminals have put in place themselves to keep under the radar. But in those days, it was so lucrative, there was so much smack about, and the market was booming. Crime was booming on the back of that. And I don't think the police through here, I know that Strathclyde Police weren't fully aware of that. And this was maybe a bit of a wake-up call about what was going on under our noses.
Well, I think that's true of us both. I mean, I think I've said to you before, the death recently of an old colleague of mine, Tommy Thompson, who was the DCI in the drug squad back in the early 80s. And I remember him saying in the early 80s to us all at Senior Officers Conference, I was a DI in the Serious Crime Squad at that time, look, drugs will come to overwhelm us all. This is an enormous wave. And really the direst of predictions. We were all a bit sceptical. We thought he was over-egging the pudding, to be frank. But you know what? He was dead right. I met him many years later and I said to him, Tom, you were absolutely spot on with your predictions.
Yeah. What did you think of the deep dive, Tom? I'm asking that because I thought we're very fair, our researchers. I think it's interesting that they're not burdened, if you like, with their background knowledge, and we know some of the people involved in the inquiry, etc. We've seen all the press, all the media coverage, and we're aware of the ultimate acquittal of Steele and Campbell. They're not aware of all that until they start digging into the case. And you could hear an enthusiasm for talking about a Glasgow case, a Scottish case. But they were very candid, I thought, in talking about the dangers of assumption that we spoke about on here before, and the need for the police to retain the integrity that we enjoy in court.
Yeah, I think you're right. They deal with the bald facts, and they're right to do that. And that's what's refreshing about our deep dive team. We were there at the time. With all that means in terms of our own feelings, our own biases, our own impressions of the general surrounding landscape of when these crimes happen. But I enjoy listening to their dispassionate version of events, because that's particularly true of our next subject, Tam Paton.
Yeah.
Because I knew Tam Paton, and I knew him quite well.
Were you in a boy band then, Tom?
No, I wasn't in a boy band, not at that time. Not at that time. That's another part of my life which I refuse to discuss. But I knew Paton. And Paton was a predator, pure and simple. Top to bottom, side to side, back to front, Paton was a predator. He was a financial predator. He was a sexual predator. His whole life was spent trying to get the better of other people in every area of his life. He was certainly one of the most despicable people I've ever met. Present company accepted, of course.
It does beg the question how you knew him. Tom, you better tell us how you knew him then. You weren't drinking partners, were you?
I knew him after the Bay City Rollers. Paton's got an interesting background, and he came from a very respectable family. His family are still in business at the moment. You still see lorries with Thomas Paton written above them going about. He was the first guy to get into the exploitation of a boy band, because the Bay City Rollers, that's what they were. They were one of the very, very early boy bands.
Yeah.
With all the frailties that meant. I mean, the Bay City Rollers were a sort of generic East Coast band that had many manifestations and many members. And I remember as a young lad, a teenage boy, going to dances and church halls, and the Bay City Rollers would be playing. But of course, it wasn't the Bay City Rollers that became famous, because they had various lineups, throughout their existence.
Okay.
But these boys who were members of the Bay City Rollers that Tam Paton got a hold of were vulnerable young people. That's what they were. They were vulnerable, very, very, as a teenage boys. And Paton, of course, saw the opportunity to market them, and that was done, and he did a good job at that. But also saw the opportunity to exploit them, and he exploited them thoroughly. And of course, running through all Paton's financial jiggery-pokery, he was also sexually very, very predatory on young boys, and he used his status as this Svengali of young boy bands and pop groups, even long after the Bay City Rollers had fallen from their pinnacle, and long after they had been thoroughly exploited and had disappeared, and to terrible ends. Of course, a lot of them got on drugs and bits and pieces. The story did not end well for these lads.
No,
they should have been set up for life with the earnings they made, and they left with practically nothing.
Do you not think, Tom, that most youngsters who reach stardom, for want of a better word, and I'm thinking here of a programme I watched just recently about Lena Zavaroni. She was 12 years of age when she was moved down south to London, signed up to an agency and taken in by them into their home, etc. And she was just, I'm going to use the word abused, but I mean she was used and abused as a financial cash cow from then on. And it led to all the problems. Most child stars go through that. I'm thinking of Michael Jackson as well. I don't know anything about the guy as a person, but I can see that he was used from a very young age as a cash cow for the Jacksons and for the family.
Yes. I think that's absolutely right. I think we're a lot better now at protecting young people, but just a few weeks ago, there was a young man who had been a member of a famous boy band, falls off a balcony or is thrown off or somehow kills him or is killed by a fall off a balcony. So I think it's still there. I think that the issue is this, that I think it's a bad thing if you reach the peak of your fame too young, too early. And that's where I think you've got the advantage, because you've yet to come good.
Yeah.
And I think,
What are you saying? You're well over the hill then?
oh, listen, I recognise I'm over the hill, but here's the thing: it's only when you get over the hill that you pick up speed. So don't,
Oh, you've got breaks. Oh, you've got breaks.
I reckon you've got to. I think you've still got to find your peak of fame, Simon. I think
you're right.
I think peaking late is a good thing, and therefore you're fine.
The peak is spelled P-E-A-K. You only peak so that you can then peak, P-E-E-K, ahead, you see.
Very good.
Tom, you mentioned Paton. Did you meet Paton then?
Yes. You see, Paton, once he left the pop scene, he was fabulously wealthy, bought a lot of property in and about the West End of Edinburgh, round about Haymarket Station. He had extensive property holdings there. And then he became one of the most prolific cannabis dealers in the west of Edinburgh.
Right.
Huge sums of money, and he was raided, and we prosecuted him time without number. The frustrating thing about it was that towards the end of his life, I'd say in the last 10, 15 years of his life, he was in very, very poor health. And therefore, when he appeared at court, accused of, basically dealing in drugs, it was always thought, well, he was too ill and too old to go to prison, and so he was given some non-custodial sentence and just carried on as he was.
Was there any suggestion, I'm only going from memory what I picked up in the press through here maybe, was there suggestion of paedophile rings and organised paedophilia through there, with him as the patriarch, if you like?
No, not of a paedophile ring, no. That's the sort of conspiracy theory stuff. What he would do, though, was he would make it known that he would manage and he would promote and he would advise young pop groups, young men. And of course, with the reputation of the Bay City Rollers, and when you went into his house, it was on the wall were a row of gold discs, won by the Bay City Rollers, top-selling records and all that sort of stuff. A bit like your football trophies, Simon, whole row.
As many as that?
Yes, as many as that there were. But so he was attractive in that regard. And a lot of these young laddies used to come along. And then again, they were vulnerable. They were young. They were desperate for success. They had stars in their eyes. And they were open to be abused, using drugs sometimes and sometimes not. And he had one or two acolytes that went with him. One man just recently convicted, a guy called Sticky Wilson, John Wilson, was just recently convicted again, even though he's quite an elderly man now, of indecencies. But no, not a ring as such, but he used to operate with a little gang of trustees. That's how I would describe it.
Right, yeah. And were you in his home regularly as a part of operational policing then?
I know, not regularly, but I was in his home. For some reason, I don't know why, but he fixated on the fact that any time he suffered any misfortune, I was responsible for it. And the guys would come back from raiding his house and saying, Tam was asking for you.
Right.
He said, how's that bad wood? But even it was nothing to do with me, but it was, I didn't object to that. He was a thoroughly objectionable character. And as I say, if you had to sum him up in one word, it would be predator. Yeah. He was a predator. Just anybody who could be exploited.
And I think that goes with his talent, if you like, for want of a better word, with marketing, because it was marketing that got the Bay City Rollers the worldwide fame that they enjoyed. And I heard a wee story about him from someone that was involved with the security of the Rollers back in the day, that Derek Longmuir, I think there were two Longmuirs, but the drummer, Longmuir, they were playing in New York one night, and Longmuir came off the stage and said to Mr. Paton, I've got a sore head. The drums give me a really sore head. Because the boys weren't really musicians at that time. As you said, they were teenagers. And they were just put on stage for the cameras. And Paton said, you've got a sore head? And before he knew it, there was an ambulance outside wherever they were playing in New York. And crowds and crowds of people. And it made the front page of the papers the next day. Longmuir was quoted as saying all he wanted was a couple of aspirin or a paracetamol for his headache, but Paton made worldwide front page news out of it.
Well, there you are. Exploitation.
Yeah.
Exploitation. Exploit anything at all.
Good.
Yeah.
And it was a good one for them to pick up on with the tartan and all that. It brought back a lot of memories for you.
It did indeed. A lot of memories for me. Not good ones, Simon, but a lot of memories.
What did you make of Sheldon Johnston?
I thought it was very, very odd, wasn't it?
Isn't it?
Very, very odd. A guy like that. I thought the deep dive teams did a super job, but a guy like that, with so much to lose and getting involved in something which was so outrageously stupid.
Yeah.
I thought it was a very, very interesting case. I'll tell you what, I wish everybody I'd dealt with was as stupid as him. I mean, because...
Yeah, there was nobody else in the frame for that one, was there?
No.
I think the whole episode was more focused on how he could be. Again, we cover it here regularly, how killers, how criminals, and we know that the most smart fraudsters and robbers and housebreakers, I'm thinking here of Johnny Romensky as well, how on one hand they can be really likeable rogues, and on the other hand, okay, it was gentle Johnny Romensky, but even killers, evil, ruthless killers who can kill their best friend and dismember them, like Sheldon did, was building a life for himself. And we all know that you can do that if you reform. You can then become a leader of reform movement to help others get rehabilitated. You can become a star in doing that. And he seemed to be doing that properly. He had all the stage to himself. He was on television. He was really going somewhere with that. And then he does that.
We spoke about your old granny and fly with crows you get shot at. Well, my old mother had another saying, leopards don't change their spots.
Tom, that's a bit mandatory, isn't it? A leopard never changes its spots. So you're saying that the whole rehabilitation and of offenders and all the schemes that we've got in place to reduce recidivism, going back to jail, you think all that's a waste of time then?
No, I don't think it's a waste of time at all. But thereafter, you've got to give people social conditions in which they can prosper and survive. If you put people into prison and then they come out and you drop them straight in the deep end and you expose them to exactly the same sort of factors as led to their offending, then you can't be surprised if they offend again. That's what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is what happens in prison is important. What happens after prison is even more important. And that's the bit we don't get right.
Yeah, the environment that they're coming back into.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So, what was the next case?
Beverly Allitt.
And this seemed quite fresh because we had just been speaking about the other nurse a couple of weeks ago. A much more modern case that's still under appeal. But Beverly Allitt was a predecessor to that, 1993.
Yeah, Beverly Allitt was the first and the classic Munchausen syndrome case. And it's very, very interesting. I dealt with a couple of these cases, not Munchausen's, but Munchausen's by proxy. Now, that's fallen out of favour now, and people don't accept the whole premise of Munchausen's by proxy. Munchausen's is if you present yourself repeatedly with physical ailments to get yourself attention. So you keep feigning illness, or you even take drugs or something to make you ill so you can get at this medical attention. And of course, that's what Beverly Allitt did. Beverly Allitt did that by attacking young children in her care and murdering them. And Munchausen's by proxy, that is that it's not yourself you're injuring, but you injure someone else, a young baby, your own child sometimes, by giving them salt or by ingesting something so that they will get medical attention and so will you. So the Allitt case was really very important. It was the first time that really came to light and the first time that it dawned on people about all the issues surrounding Munchausen's. And the one thing that struck me about it was, okay, it's wisdom in hindsight, but when you look at Beverly Allitt in the cold light of day, when you're investigating her, there were all sorts of psychological clues there as to her state of mind long before she offended. But of course, as we've discussed many times, you only know that once you've got them.
Hindsight. She was self-harming and whatnot, wasn't she, and making us all sorts of reasons to get medical attention for herself, and it then became by proxy
Yes,
because
that's
of
exactly right.
because of her position as a. It's more twisted than that as well, Tom, isn't it? She befriended one of the mothers of one of the children that she was harming as well.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
some real dark stuff going on in there.
But that again, you see, is very like the last nurse we spoke about, where she wrote letters to them and attended the funerals, and it's all of this gratuitous, wanting to become involved, wanting to be part of the scene. But a very, very interesting and a very disturbing case, Beverly Allitt, not least because of it absolutely undermined the confidence people had in the nursing profession. I mean, if you cannot trust your infant to the care of nurses, then it's where do you go from there? Where do you go from there?
So she was convicted of killing 4 children,
Mm-hmm.
attempt murder of 3, and grievous bodily harm of 6 other kids. I think it was interesting, the deep dive team they went into afterwards, her sentencing as well. She was sentenced to 13 life sentences, which was a landmark in itself. But she immediately started to try, and she said, I'll never go to prison, because she was manipulating even at that stage and wanted to get out of the institution she was in into mainstream prison because she knew that she could then be eligible for parole. So a real scheming woman, wasn't she?
Yes, she was. Absolutely. Very disturbing case.
Yeah.
And as disturbing, as disturbing in a way as our next case, the Peter Sutcliffe case, the so-called Yorkshire Ripper. I hate these nicknames, and I mean, there was nothing ripping about. He didn't disembowel people and that. So I don't know where the Yorkshire Ripper came in as a sort of counterpoise to the Whitechapel Ripper, but the Peter Sutcliffe case was a disaster for the British Police Service and the salvation of the British Police Service, because it exposed all the weaknesses there were in the way that we administered serious crime at that time. And it brought about the Byford report. It was a disaster with 13 young women killed, some of them sex workers, some of them not, over the whole of the north of England. There was a huge effort that went into trying to track down the person who had killed these people. But of course, they were using the old card index systems that we've discussed before on this podcast. And this case was their nemesis. This was the case where it was finally shown that they were just not up to it, when you were dealing with a whole lot of investigations in different parts, in different forces, with different card index systems. This was really the time where it came crashing down. And of course, it transpired that Peter Sutcliffe had been in their system, had been interviewed multiple times, but the investigation had missed him and had been sidetracked by a hoaxer who sent a tape to the SIO, George Oldfield. And so everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. However, and here's the thing, the Byford report that came as a result of the Peter Sutcliffe case was, in my view, one of the finest, most focused, most important police reports in my time. And of course, that brought about the HOLMES system, the role of Officer in Overall Command, and a whole lot of other recommendations which were put in place and which we lived with, and which were a tremendous bonus in criminal investigations to come from that. So the Sutcliffe case was a disaster, but at least there was something positive came from it. And what came from it was modern, computer-assisted policing.
You mentioned, Tom, the term, the Yorkshire Ripper. And again, because of what we're doing more regularly now, we're listening to our deep dives, delving into these cases more impartially than you and I can, because we know some of the... Did you know George Oldfield, by the way?
I met him. Long after he'd retired. And he had an excellent reputation. And that's the thing. I mean, my old boss, Hector Clark, worked on the Yorkshire Ripper case, or the Sutcliffe case, or one of the peripheral cases to do with the Sutcliffe case. And his view was that were very, very fine detectives worked on that case. but they had been let down by inadequate systems. It comes back to one of my central tenets in all this stuff is that you need good people and good systems. When Hector Clark came to Lothian and Borders and took over what turned out to be the Black Inquiry, he insisted, absolutely insisted, that we had a computerised index system before Holmes was brought in. And the reason he did that was because he was so badly marked by the Sutcliffe case.
Yeah. I wanted to mention that because people like George Oldfield, who I wouldn't have known his name if you hadn't said it, people like him who become SIOs of major inquiries, serial inquiries like that, they've obviously got long distinguished careers to get there in the first place. They're obviously very experienced and probably solved dozens, if not hundreds of cases beforehand. And then one mistake, although it was a major mistake, the assumptions that he made in this case can taint your whole career. So I just wanted you to relate that, because he'll be no longer with us, I would imagine.
No. George died many, many years ago. Yeah, it was a terrible shame because he was a fine man and a very good detective. That's the truth of the matter, is you're not remembered for all your victories. You're only remembered for your defeats. And in that case, he was, and it was a shame. And a lot of other officers too. One of your old chief constables, Andrew Sloan. Sloan was a West Yorkshire man. And there's an interesting story about Sloan and the effect that the Sutcliffe killings had on Sloan. When he came up to Strathclyde, he was horrified to learn that there were no computerised index systems there, and insisted that straight away that they start working on it, because he had been badly marked by the Sutcliffe case.
Yeah.
And there was a great story that I heard that at that time, the Home Office had offered all Scottish forces money to install computers which would be linked between all Scottish forces and they could use it for major inquiries. But it was on the condition that they all installed the same computer system. But it was going to take 2 years to put in or whatever. When Sloan came to Strathclyde, he said, I can't wait. I'm not waiting 2 years. I want this done now, because he was so influenced by what had happened, what had gone wrong. He wasn't prepared to be the chief of a large force like Strathclyde without the most sophisticated systems. So he put his in ahead of the rest of Scotland. We had ours before because of the Caroline Hogg case. But that meant that the Home Office withdrew their funding, and so a lot of the smaller forces like Northern and whatnot didn't get the money that they'd been promised from the Home Office. But I couldn't blame Andrew Sloan because he was marked by it. And interestingly, I found out just a matter of 2 months ago that your old chief, Sir Andrew Sloan, was related to Sergeant Robert Sloan of Dumfriesshire Constabulary, who did such a fine job at the Ruxton murder site. Now there, how's that? How's that?
Wow.
How's that?
We've come full circle here with this podcast.
We have.
That's brilliant.
But you see, I sometimes wondered, Simon, if the Sutcliffe case had not gone badly wrong, the Byford report had not been submitted, and that the whole of the police service had moved forward in the way of Holmes, would we have solved the World's End murders? Yeah? Would we?
Yeah.
Would we have been able to do such a good job when Robert Black was arrested for the murders of the girls in the Borders? So it's tantalising, isn't it, about what the consequences and what the knock-ons of all these things were.
I think the truth of the matter, and we know this, is that the volume of murders we had at that time, much more than we have today, they freed up detective time, Tom. That's what they did. They freed up the time, the amount of inquiries that could be done, the amount of interviews, the length of time you could spend with witnesses and chase down leads. It expanded all of that because the admin became specialist in the office, and you didn't have detectives tied up in the office doing the admin as well.
Yeah, eventually it did, Simon, but right at the beginning, I remember when Holmes was introduced at first, we've discussed this before too, it was because we were unfamiliar with computers, never mind the computerized systems, then it took more time, and it was a huge investment of money and time and training, but it was well worth it. It was well worth it.
Let me ask you a final question on that then before we move on. If we'd had Holmes or computerised systems across the forces, because the Ripper worked across forces as well, didn't he? If we'd had computerised systems when he was at work, when Sutcliffe was at his worst, do you think we'd have caught him a lot quicker?
No question about it. No question about it, because even the very early home system, if you'd put in interviewing Peter Sutcliffe, it would immediately pinged up, ping, this man's been interviewed before. On this occasion, this occasion, this occasion, this occasion. And there were a big light flashing, and the office manager, where he come and say, hang on a minute, it's tying together these loose ends that the early home system was actually designed to do and was very good at. So I have no doubt about that.
And anyone going to speak to him would be armed with the statement that he made before, or statements that he had made before.
Well, that's right. But not only that, he had been, one of the times he'd been arrested in charge, in possession, of a ball-peen hammer. So a hammer with a rounded end, which was one of the weapons, or very similar to one of the weapons used in the attack. And the other thing about Sutcliffe was that he had a co-accused. In one of his offences, there was a driver who went with him for the attack, and the driver had actually gone to the police and reported Peter Sutcliffe and had been ignored. Now, if he'd had the home system, he would not have had that human fallibility. It would have been tied together and it would all come out. And of course, that's exactly how the home system was designed. It was designed so that the lessons from the Sutcliffe case were learned and the faults and flaws of the Sutcliffe case could be overcome.
One of the lads who was on an Alicante trip last week is a civilian with the police, and he was a Holmes trainer. And he worked on your inquiry. He worked on your World's End inquiry.
Did he?
For 2 or 3 years.
Aye.
Yes. In the office, obviously, on the Holmes system.
My heart goes out to these folk, because a lot of these people, they weren't trained in computer sciences. They just picked it up. And they were really, really good at it. I knew a guy who was a really good flying squad officer. And he became interested in homes, and he started to specialise in homes, and he turned out he was an absolutely superb homes operator. And I always thought that proved to me that the police service has tremendous flexibility within it.
Yeah.
There are people who can turn their hand to most things at the end of the day. You know?
And if you can get someone in the right niche and something that they're interested in, then you've won awards.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting listening to a former senior officer saying that. I never thought you would realise that upstairs at all.
Well, the thing is, Simon,
I thought you guys took great pride in trying to fit square pegs into round holes. Actually.
What you always seem to forget, Simon, is that I wasn't always a senior officer. I actually started on the bottom rung of the same ladder as you did.
Something I meant to ask you, Tom, you've got this thing about motor cars, that you're a self-confessed motor car buff. Yep. And I know about your motorbikes and all that. Yeah. Well, did you never want to go into the traffic? Are you one of these frustrated traffic cops, really?
No, not really. I did the advanced motorcycle course, which I very much enjoyed. I used to speak to a lot of recruits coming in and say, what do you fancy doing? And say, I'd like to be a dog handler. I'd like to be a mountie. I'd like to ride the horse. And I say, well, hang on a minute. Think about it. Would you like to do that all the time?
Yeah.
No. Listen, there's nothing so diverse and interesting and exciting because of the differences as general police duties. And my aspiration was always to be a detective. I think perhaps because my father had been a detective and I'd listened to a whole lot of detective talk when I was a laddie. I don't know, but I didn't want to... I admired the motorcyclists, particularly later on when I was policing major events and VIP movements and all that sort of stuff. I began to value tremendously both the mounted section and the motorcycle, particularly the motorcycle escort groups, who were fantastic. And I always admire a special place for them. I couldn't have done it myself, Simon. I would have ended up wrapped around a bus shelter somewhere.
We saw an escort going through on Friday. I don't know who it was, obviously a dignitary of some description. And it started with the one bike stopping the traffic and the blue light on. And my partner said, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Just sit and watch for a minute. You'll be fascinated by this." And sure enough, up they came. And it's clockwork, isn't it? It's great to watch how they work.
It's very good. It's very highly skilled. And it's
Yes,
very high risk as well.
for sure.
But yeah, I thoroughly admire the bikers. Yeah.
Tom, the other one that we spoke about here, and there's a kind of theme through all of these serial killers and some of this, as I was saying, some of the stuff that I hadn't heard of as well. And this one is the Moors murders. I was thinking that, again, the role that the press play in these major inquiries, I think it's a lot better now. I think because of the new laws and regulations that we have and cooperation of the press in a lot of ways, they kind of self-regulate to some degree, even with the royals, with the news, etc. But back in the day, when we spoke here about Bible John, these cases were the Ripper itself. They had a kind of life of their own that the press pursued for their own purposes, which bore little resemblance to the reality of the inquiry that was going on.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I'm not sure things have improved. I think that the press have fallen back and we do not have the investigative journalists that we used to have. And that's regrettable because some of them are very good, actually, and did a very good job. But what we have is the wild west of social media, where all sorts of hairs are set running. And that to me is much more dangerous because people are scapegoated, false information. I mean, look at the recent riots down south, very much instigated by social media. So I would rather have had a professional, well-regulated, well-staffed and well-resourced press. I think that's a healthy thing in a democracy. I really do. And okay, sometimes I could have cussed them up and down, but at the end of the day, you had to respect that they had a job to do, and so did we, and there was a lot of common ground. And I used to say to them, and I used to lecture to young journalists, and I used to say, look, the police and the press, we play on the same ground and we play with the same ball, but the goals are different and the rules are different. And so we've got a lot in common, but we'll never have everything in common. And the minute we have everything in common between police and press, somebody's not doing their job.
Yeah, that's for sure. Quite profound. And we'll need to get Jane on and have a wee chat with her again, Jane Hamilton, who we had on in season 2. She'll have a good perspective on this as well. But I think one of the problems is that if you give the press nothing, they've still got newspapers to fill, they've still got web pages to fill. So they're going to start coming up with speculation and speaking to so-called experts and all the rest of it. So it really needs a degree of cooperation between the police and the press to give them what they need, their goals, and help them work towards our goals, which is catching criminals.
In a major inquiry, Simon, you've got to feed the beast or the beast will eat you.
Yeah.
They need lines of inquiry, and if you do not give them proper lines to speak about, then they'll make something up. They're under tremendous pressure to do that.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Ruxton case is a classic example of that. And actually, the media manager of that for the time was actually pretty good. But some of the other cases have gone horribly, horribly long. As you say, with a dearth of information, you create a vacuum and something will always fill a vacuum. And usually it's false information.
The one that brought it to me recently was the limbs in the loch. I was watching it on the television.
Oh, yeah.
And you could see the SIO's frustration, thinking back to how the inquiry, his hand was being forced by what the newspapers were publishing.
Yeah.
Too much information. It had a happy ending, of course, if you can call it that. But so our final case was the Moors murders, Tom, another horrible case. And what I wanted to ask you about was that relationship again between the male and the female committing these crimes. So unusual, but we've had our fair share here in the UK, haven't we?
It is unusual, and when it does happen, of course, they're very, very difficult to detect because it's so unusual. But in the case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, I've always thought that Hindley was actually the instigator in this. I always thought she played a prominent role, a leading role in the pair, because she would procure the victims for Ian Brady. And she was a very manipulative sort. And I don't know if you remember, but later on, after long-term imprisonment, she embraced religion and convinced all sorts of senior church people that she was rehabilitated and she got out, and there was a huge campaign to free Myra Hindley. And unfortunately, one of the mothers of one of the laddies that whose body was never found, played a very, very key role in saying no, and really was the centre of a resistance to Myra Hindley getting out, which I think was justice, because I think the crimes were so appalling, there can be no forgiveness. And there can be no rehabilitation from crimes like the Moors murders. Particularly, and I think I was at the college for some course or other, and we were lectured, I can't remember which one it was, by one of the people who had been on the case, and he played us the little tape of Leslie Ann Down. They recorded her pleading for her life when they were torturing her. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I just don't. I cannot forgive that.
And they couldn't even give the family, the wee boy's body's never been found to this day.
No, that's right. And I don't know. I mean, the Saddleworth Moor is a vast, vast area, and whether in fact he'd forgotten or sent the wrong place, I mean, there's no real landmark. So I'm not sure. But for years, Brady led people on and said he would take them to places and stuff like that. And of course, he never did. Yes. And the mother of that wee lad just died a few years ago, never having found out what happened to her son, which was terrible, absolutely terrible.
I'm with you, Tom, on that one. We've agreed. It's only taken us 3.5 seasons to agree about something.
It was Keith Bennett's mum who really, she was the centre of resistance to Myra Hindley getting out. And every time there was, and the seniors, politicians and churchmen would say, look, Myra Hindley, she's embraced religion, she's a reformed character and all the rest of it. And every time Keith Bennett's mum would pop up and say, well, hang on a minute, and the public mood would change. Years later, when I was dealing with another case, I met a psychologist who actually spent a great deal of her time interviewing and dealing with Ian Brady, who was in a secure establishment down south. And she said that he was a textbook psychopathic character and was very, very interesting to study from a professional point of view. Yeah.
Tom, that's been fascinating. Something that runs through all of this, and I've spoken about it a few times to you, how the criminals themselves, whether they're killers or fraudsters or rapists or paedophiles, they don't see themselves as that very often. And I remember the book that I read many years ago. I don't think you have read it. Intuitively, I don't think you've read this book. Just getting to know you a wee bit, because it was a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
I wrote it. That's my pseudonym. I wrote that book, Simon.
I don't think
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I think you delegated the task of reading that to someone else. But what I was going to say was that the very first chapter, if you remember, I've not read it for years, but I remember the very first chapter when he talks about Al Capone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Al Capone gave a lot of money to charity and children's hospitals. And Al Capone actually thought that he was a good guy. He thought that he was a stand-up member of the community, and why would anybody want to lock him up?
Well, I mean, the fable of Robin Hood's got a lot to answer for, because he thought he was a modern-day Robin Hood. But, Al Capone is attributed with one of my favourite sayings. Al Capone said, you get a lot further with a kind word and a gun than you do with a kind word. But as for winning friends and influencing people, I consider myself recently to have hugely successful because I've got at least 2 friends in Glasgow. You and Chris.
Sure.
And I mean, that's a social achievement.
What we'll need to do, Tom, we've used his name a few times, and we talk about the back office team and all that. And even in our live show, he got a round of applause that I think he might have inserted into the recording of it. But he did get a round of applause because you said how much work he does and thanked him for all the work. I think we'll need to get him on maybe next week and have a wee chat with him. Maybe deflect some of the criticism to him, maybe.
Well, listen, I tell you what, Chris is a very interested and interesting person. And I see Chris as, what like a galley slave on one of these ancient ships, you know. we're up on the top, directing the thing, and you know, oh, head over there, and all the time somebody's down below with the oars. That's Chris. That's Chris.
Oh, well, I hope we can edit this out without him hearing that. I was in real trouble.
Listen. If Chris was a sensitive person, he wouldn't have anything to do with you, let's be honest.
We'll get him on for a wee chat next week, Tom. I'm really looking forward to this week's episode. I've got a vague idea, one or two of them, but I don't really know what they're going to come up with. I'm really enjoying this process of a daily podcast on Crime Time Inc.
I find them extremely stimulating, Simon, because they prod a thing and you think, oh yes, I remember that case. And then you think, oh yeah, that was what came from that case. And this week, I'm thinking about Peter Sutcliffe and thinking about all the consequences of Peter Sutcliffe and thinking how these consequences actually shape my career and your career, the way that we worked and what we did. Sometimes these changes come about as part of something that's very good, like the Ruxton case, and sometimes they come about as something that's very bad, like Peter Sutcliffe, but all contribute to advances in criminal investigation that we enjoyed and that we benefited from.
I think we run parallel to the legal system itself, Tom, which is always evolving. Mm-hmm. It's always looking at itself and looking at history and cases, how they were dealt with, decisions that were made in the past that inform what we're doing now and moving forward. And I think the police are exactly the same, and we can see that. And I'm seeing it more clearly now because we're talking about it, and the net is wider now because of our deep dive team, that we're looking globally. Crime investigation and crime fighting is moving forward all the time in order to thwart the killers, etc.
I'm looking forward to spreading our side across the world. And of course, I know that you are heading down under in the new year for a while. So I hope that we can look at some crimes from that part of the world. And particularly, I'd like to look at the famous dingo case where allegedly a child was eaten by a dingo, and there were all sorts of suspicions about that. So that'd be good.
Oh, well, I really look forward to that. That sounds fascinating. Tom, I look forward to it. And good listening this week. I'll be listening avidly and doing my homework as usual. And I look forward to speaking to you next week.
Okay, take care of yourself. Bye-bye.